Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were both killed by multiple sharp point injuries.
Sources telling ET the killer is allegedly their own son, Nick.
Some truths arrive quietly, not as scandals, but as records. In the shadow of fame, Rob Reiner's wife compiled a final report, part memory, part reckoning. Inside it were 7 details that reframed power, partnership, and legacy. What do we miss when we only watch the movies? Number 1. The quiet architecture of power. The report begins not with headlines, but with rooms, small, closed spaces where influence moved without witnesses. While Rob Reiner's career unfolded across sets and studios, his wife observed the unseen mechanics behind each project. Meetings that shaped films before scripts were finalized. Conversations where restraint mattered more than authority. It reframes power not as dominance, but as choreography. Who speaks last and who listens longest. What gives this detail its weight is how unremarkable it first appears. There are no raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, just bodies leaning back in chairs, pauses held a second longer than necessary, and decisions that seemed to arrive naturally. The report describes these rooms as functional, almost forgettable. Yet, function itself became the instrument. Control was exercised through pacing, through silence, through the ability to wait while others rushed to fill the space. She notes that authority rarely announced itself. It settled into the room gradually, carried by the person least eager to dominate it. In one reflective passage, she paraphrases a lesson learned through repetition. The room always followed the person who did not need to speak first. Silence created gravity. Others revealed their intentions too early, mistaking speed for confidence. The report does not dramatize this dynamic. It documents it almost clinically, as if mapping a structure that had always existed but was rarely named. As the section unfolds, she widens the lens. Power was not confined to formal meetings. It migrated into corridors, parking lots, and unplanned dinners. Decisions hardened in motion, not in sessions. She writes about how influence preferred these margins, where accountability softened and candor felt safer. In these spaces, ideas were tested quietly, without risk, before being presented as consensus later. Midway through the report, she challenges the mythology of spontaneous creativity. Scripts, she explains, were often casualties of conversations that happened long before the first page was read. By the time people believed they were choosing, she observed, the choice had already been arranged. This was not manipulation in the traditional sense. It was framing. Repetition gave ideas inevitability. Agreement emerged less from conviction than from familiarity. What sharpens her insight is proximity without authorship. She stood close enough to see patterns, far enough to be excluded from credit. From that vantage point, she noticed how recognition followed visibility, rather than contribution. Restraint was celebrated only when it served the final outcome. Over time, this system rewarded emotional discipline above imagination. Those who could detach survived. Those who questioned rhythm slowed momentum and were quietly sidelined. The report lingers on the psychological cost of this architecture. Constant vigilance replaced trust. Every pause carried implication. Every silence risked misreading. She describes an environment where people learned to perform calm even when uncertainty churned underneath. The rooms demanded composure, and composure became currency. Creativity, once driven by risk, adapted to predictability. This adaptation, she implies, happened slowly enough that few noticed it taking hold. Near the end of the section, she offers a final reflection that reframes everything before it. Power preferred to appear effortless, she wrote, because effort would have revealed intention. This was the genius of the system. Nothing felt overtly broken. Efficiency masked imbalance. Calm concealed control. And when consequences eventually surfaced, responsibility had already dispersed across too many hands to trace. She adds one final observation, almost as an afterthought, noting how these patterns endured precisely because they felt natural to those inside them. Normality, she suggests, was the system's greatest defense. The section closes without accusation, only clarity. Power, she concludes, did not live in the spotlight. It lived in the pauses before decisions, in the rooms no one remembered afterward. And those who mastered the silence shaped outcomes long before anyone else believed a choice had been made. Number 2, marriage as a working system. Rather than romance, the report details logistics. Schedules negotiated like shooting days. Creative disagreements handled with the same discipline as editorial notes. Rob Reiner's wife writes about marriage as infrastructure, unseen when it works, catastrophic when it fails. The shock is not conflict, but how deliberately it was managed, turning private life into a stabilizing force for public ambition. From the outset, she resists sentimentality. Love is not described as a feeling but as a practice, maintained, adjusted, and occasionally repaired. Days were planned with the precision of production calendars. Travel, downtime, and proximity were treated as finite resources, not emotional afterthoughts. She explains that nothing strained a relationship faster than assuming availability. Structure, not spontaneity, preserved continuity. The report emphasizes that disagreements were inevitable, but chaos was not. Arguments followed rules. Timing mattered. Tone mattered more. She recalls moments when frustration was postponed deliberately, not suppressed, but scheduled, so it would not collide with external pressure. In one understated reflection, she paraphrases a guiding principle. We never argued when exhaustion could speak louder than honesty. Discipline protected clarity and prevented temporary emotions from shaping permanent damage. This system extended into creative life. Scripts discussed at home were not rehearsals for control, but exercises in separation. She notes how boundaries prevented resentment. Ideas could be challenged without challenging the person who brought them. The marriage absorbed tension so it did not spill into professional spaces. In doing so, it quietly stabilized careers, shaped by constant evaluation, rejection, and public scrutiny that rarely paused long enough for recovery. Over time, this separation preserved mutual respect, even when external opinions shifted unpredictably, protecting their shared sense of direction. Midway through the section, she reframes conflict itself. Conflict was not a failure of harmony, but evidence of engagement. What mattered was containment. Disagreement was useful, she observed, as long as it did not become the headline. The marriage functioned as a filter, absorbing volatility before it reached the outside world. This was not self-denial. It was strategic endurance, built on foresight rather than impulse, and reinforced through repetition rather than grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. She also writes candidly about the labor imbalance inherent in such systems. Infrastructure requires maintenance, and maintenance is often invisible. Emotional preparation, schedule alignment, conflict deferral demanded energy that was rarely acknowledged publicly. Yet she frames this not as sacrifice, but as authorship. She chose the role consciously, aware of its costs and its influence. The report lingers on moments when the system nearly failed, periods when external pressure overwhelmed internal order. She describes these not as betrayals, but as stress tests. When routines cracked, they were rebuilt with adjustments rather than nostalgia. The marriage evolved because it had to. Static systems collapse. Flexible ones endure. Adaptation, she suggests, was the truest expression of commitment, and the only reason longevity remained possible under constant strain. Near the end of the section, she articulates the deeper irony. The more functional the partnership became, the less visible it was to others. Stability attracted little attention. People noticed the work only when it stopped working, she wrote, never while it was holding everything together. This invisibility was both protection and erasure, a paradox she learned to accept without resentment or the need for validation. She concludes by observing that marriage, when treated as infrastructure, rarely earns applause, but its absence is immediately felt. Careers wobble, decisions fray, focus scatters. The system's success lay in what never happened: crises diffused, resentment contained, momentum preserved during moments when collapse would have been easy and recovery uncertain. The section closes on a quietly resonant truth. By refusing to romanticize partnership, she helped sustain it, and in doing so, turned private. Discipline into the unseen framework, supporting public ambition, longevity, and creative stability. Number 3. The cost of being the calmest voice. In moments of industry volatility, she became the quiet center. The report recounts times when silence was mistaken for agreement, patience for consent. Her steadiness allowed others to escalate. This section lingers on the irony, how being the calmest person in the room often means absorbing the most pressure, without credit or relief. She describes how this role was never formally assigned. It emerged through repetition. When tempers flared, she slowed the pace. When deadlines tightened, she softened the edges. Over time, calm became expected of her, not appreciated. The report makes clear that composure, once demonstrated, quickly turns into obligation. Others began to rely on her steadiness as a stabilizer, unaware of the cost it demanded internally. What complicates this dynamic is how easily restraint is misread. Silence was often interpreted as approval. Patience was taken as permission. She notes moments when her decision to wait was later cited as consent for outcomes she never endorsed. In a measured reflection, she paraphrases the pattern plainly. I learned that quiet does not stay neutral for long. It eventually gets rewritten. The calmest voice became the most editable. As pressures mounted, her composure created space for others to escalate. Louder personalities filled the vacuum. Emotional reactions gained legitimacy simply because they were visible. She absorbed frustration so others could release it. The report frames this not as altruism, but as a role reinforced by reward structures. Calm made systems function. Systems then depended on calm. Midway through the section, she examines the physical toll of this expectation. Emotional regulation required constant vigilance. Tone was monitored, reactions rehearsed internally before being expressed, if they were expressed at all. She writes about fatigue that came not from conflict itself, but from the continuous suppression of instinct. Holding the center meant never leaning anywhere, she observed, even when imbalance was obvious. Stability demanded stillness, and stillness became exhausting. The report also addresses visibility. Escalation attracts attention. Calm rarely does. In high-pressure environments, urgency is mistaken for importance. By diffusing tension, she removed spectacle, and with it, recognition. Her work disappeared the moment it succeeded. When outcomes improved, credit drifted elsewhere. When outcomes faltered, her silence was re-examined for blame. She recounts specific moments when speaking sooner might have altered outcomes, but at the risk of becoming the disruption herself. The choice was never between silence and speech, but between being effective and being visible. The report does not present this as martyrdom. It presents it as a calculation, one made repeatedly, often under time pressure, often without acknowledgement. Later in the section, she reflects on how this pattern reshaped relationships. People began to approach her not for perspective, but for containment. She became a place where tension could be deposited safely. Over time, this altered how others listened to her. Calmness, once a strength, became a boundary others did not think to cross. They came to me for balance, she wrote, but not always for truth. The emotional paradox sharpened. To remain effective, she had to remain unreactive. To be heard, she would have had to disrupt the very equilibrium she was maintaining. The report suggests that many systems quietly depend on such figures, individuals who absorb instability so outcomes appear seamless. Yet those individuals rarely shape the narrative of success. As the section draws to a close, she names the final cost. Calm, sustained too long, can erode self-trust. When instincts are deferred repeatedly, they grow quieter. Doubt creeps in, not about decisions, but about the right to voice them. The calmest voice risks forgetting what it sounds like when raised. The section ends on a restrained conclusion. Being the calmest person in the room may keep everything from falling apart, but it often does so by asking one person to carry the weight alone, silently, until calm itself becomes the heaviest burden. Number 4. Hollywood's selective memory. The report confronts how narratives harden over time. As films became classics, contributions narrowed to a single name. She documents how collaboration slowly eroded into myth-making, leaving out those who shaped tone, pacing, and moral boundaries. It is not bitterness, it is a record correction, written before memory fully calcifies. She begins by describing memory as an editing process. Just like a film, the story of how something was made gets trimmed, simplified, and streamlined for retelling. Complexity is the first casualty. In early stages, success is shared language. We made this together. But as a claim settles, ownership narrows. Names disappear quietly, not through malice, but convenience. A cleaner story travels farther, even when it leaves crucial context behind. The report traces this narrowing with precision. Early interviews referenced teams, debates, and friction. Later ones favored singular vision. Over time, repetition hardened interpretation. She writes that memory did not distort facts so much as compress them. What did not fit the legend was not argued against. She observed, it was simply no longer repeated. Silence, once again, became a collaborator. She documents how tone and pacing, elements rarely credited explicitly, were among the first contributions to vanish from public memory. Decisions about what not to show, when to pause, when to soften an ending rather than sharpen it. These choices shaped audience experience but resisted attribution. As years passed, such invisible labor dissolved into authorship, attributed to a single figure. The report is careful not to frame this as theft. Instead, it describes a cultural mechanism. Hollywood rewards clarity over accuracy. Audiences prefer a protagonist, not a network. Journalists need a hook. Awards need a name. In that environment, collaboration becomes background noise. The story wanted a hero, she wrote, and heroes require simplicity. Complexity slows applause and discourages nuance. Midway through the section, she reflects on the emotional impact of this erosion. Watching a shared history become someone else's mythology creates a peculiar dissonance. You recognize the story, but not the version being told. She recalls moments of self-doubt, not about her contributions, but about whether they ever mattered, if they could be erased so easily. The report frames this not as grievance, but as disorientation that quietly accumulates over time, shaping how one remembers oneself. She also notes how selective memory reshapes future behavior. When certain contributions go unacknowledged, they stop being offered. Why argue for nuance if nuance disappears? Why protect moral boundaries if they are later attributed elsewhere? Over time, silence becomes self-preserving. The system does not just forget. It trains people to stop insisting on being remembered. Later, she addresses the role of time itself. Distance smooths edges. Conflict fades faster than success. As decades pass, disagreement feels inconvenient, even rude. She writes that memory prefers harmony retroactively, even when harmony never existed. Time forgives selectively, she observed, and it forgives the version that travels best. This forgiveness benefits legibility, not truth. The report makes clear that myth-making is not merely historical, it is ongoing. Each retelling reinforces the last. Corrections feel disruptive. Footnotes are rarely welcomed. And so the record settles, not because it is complete, but because it is comfortable. She writes with urgency here, aware that silence, once prolonged, becomes indistinguishable from absence, especially to those who arrive later. As the section nears its end, she explains why documenting this mattered. Not to reclaim credit publicly, but to preserve internal coherence, to know what actually happened, even if the world never does. Memory, she suggests, is also a form of self-respect, a quiet refusal to disappear inside someone else's version of events. The section closes on a restrained but pointed realization. Hollywood's selective memory does not erase people loudly. It fades them out gradually until the story feels complete without them, and no one remembers there was ever anything missing. Number 5. Boundaries that saved careers. Among the most startling details are the projects declined, scripts passed over, meetings ended early. The report argues that restraint preserved credibility, relationships, and mental health. In an industry addicted to momentum, boundaries became acts of authorship, decisions that defined legacy as much as the films themselves. She frames refusal not as absence, but as presence. Each no carried intention. In an environment where opportunity is treated as scarcity, declining work is often misread as fear or arrogance. The report counters that assumption carefully. Boundaries, she explains, were never about disengagement. They were about alignment. Saying yes indiscriminately diluted purpose. Saying no preserved it. The report catalogs these refusals without spectacle. No dramatic exits. No ultimatums. Just early endings to meetings that drifted off course, conversations paused when tone shifted, projects declined before obligation hardened into resentment. She writes that momentum, left unchecked, becomes coercive. Speed has a way of pretending it is necessity, she observed, until stopping feels irresponsible. Boundaries interrupted that illusion. What emerges is a philosophy of selective engagement. Work was assessed not only for creative merit, but for its downstream effects. Who would it align them with? What compromises would it normalize? How much recovery would it require afterward? The report makes clear that sustainability was never accidental. It was designed through restraint, recalculated repeatedly as circumstances shifted and stakes increased across different phases of professional life. Each refusal clarified direction rather than limiting possibility. Midway through the section, she reflects on how boundaries protected relationships as much as careers. Declining a project early preserved respect. Accepting it reluctantly often corroded trust. She describes how clarity prevented future conflict. No quiet resentment, no unspoken blame. The cleanest break, she wrote, was always the earliest one. Boundaries, enforced early, spared everyone prolonged negotiation later. She also addresses the internal resistance to restraint. Turning down work triggered doubt, fear of being forgotten, fear of misjudging timing. The report does not minimize this anxiety. It acknowledges it as the cost of authorship. Choosing less meant living with uncertainty longer. Yet she notes that overcommitment produced a different uncertainty, one marked by exhaustion, blurred priorities, and diminished judgment that lingered far longer and proved harder to repair. The report situates these choices within a broader industry context. Hollywood rewards availability. Momentum is praised. Pausing is suspect. Against that backdrop, boundaries appeared countercultural. She writes that restraint slowed the narrative around them, but strengthened its coherence. Careers became shaped rather than accumulated, defined by intention instead of sheer volume. She is careful to note that boundaries were not static. They evolved. What was acceptable once became untenable later. The report emphasizes review, periodic reassessment of limits as circumstances changed. Flexibility mattered, but so did consistency. A boundary enforced once and abandoned later lost credibility. both internally and externally, weakening its future effectiveness. Near the end of the section, she articulates the quiet reward of restraint: fewer apologies, fewer repairs. Decisions aged better when they were made without pressure. Nothing aged worse than a yes given out of panic, she reflected. Boundaries, she suggests, created a longer horizon, one where legacy was shaped intentionally rather than reactively. The emotional core of the section rests in what these boundaries prevented. Burnout deferred, relationships preserved, trust maintained. By declining certain paths, others remained open. The report treats absence as an active force. What did not happen mattered as much as what did, even years later. As the section closes, she reframes restraint one final time. Boundaries were not walls, they were edits, cuts made for rhythm, pacing, and meaning. In choosing what to leave out, she helped define what remained. And in an industry obsessed with output, that discipline became its own quiet form of authorship. Number 6. Watching the machine from the inside. Being close to power did not insulate her from its damage. The report describes witnessing reputations rise and collapse with alarming speed. Loyalty tested, ethics negotiated. She writes with clinical clarity about how systems reward compliance, not conscience. An observation sharpened by years spent adjacent to influence but never absorbed by it. She begins by dismantling a common illusion. Proximity equals protection. From the outside, closeness to decision-makers appears like insulation. From the inside, it feels more like exposure. She documents how being near power meant seeing its volatility up close. The sudden shifts in allegiance, the quiet recalibration of values when stakes increased. Nothing stayed fixed for long. Stability was temporary, conditional, and often dependent on perception rather than substance. This instability became the background rhythm of everyday decisions. The report details moments when reputations inflated overnight, only to deflate just as quickly. Praise was rarely proportional to contribution. Condemnation often arrived without warning. She observed how narratives could pivot based on convenience rather than truth. What unsettled her most was not the speed of change, but how easily people adapted to it. Familiarity replaced shock, and surprise gradually disappeared. Loyalty, she writes, was constantly renegotiated. It was not anchored to individuals, but to outcomes. Support shifted depending on who was winning, who was visible, who still offered access. In one restrained reflection, she paraphrases the pattern plainly. Loyalty lasted exactly as long as usefulness did. Moral language remained, but moral consistency did not. Alignment replaced allegiance. Midway through the section, she turns her attention to ethics, not as principles, but as transactions. Compromises were rarely dramatic. They were incremental. A line moved slightly. A standard adjusted quietly. Each decision felt defensible in isolation. Accumulated, they reshaped behavior. She writes that the system rewarded those who could rationalize fastest, not those who resisted longest. Over time, justification became a survival skill. Her vantage point mattered. She was close enough to see decisions being made, far enough to avoid being fully implicated in them. That distance sharpened her observations. She noticed how dissent was framed as inefficiency, how hesitation was labeled impractical. The system called it realism, she wrote, but realism always seemed to favor whoever already had leverage. Conscience slowed progress. Compliance accelerated it. The report also captures the emotional cost of witnessing this repeatedly. She describes a gradual desensitization. Not approval, but familiarity. What once felt alarming began to feel procedural. This normalization disturbed her more than overt corruption. The machine did not need cruelty to function. It only needed participation, repetition, and silence. She recounts moments when she considered intervening, speaking up, disrupting the flow. Each time, The calculation was the same. Would it change the outcome or simply reposition her? The report does not romanticize resistance. It acknowledges the limits of individual action within entrenched systems. I learned when conscience was invited, she reflected, and when it was simply tolerated. Tolerance was not influence. As the section deepens, she examines how systems deflect responsibility. Decisions were rarely owned by one person. Authority diffused blame efficiently. When outcomes failed, accountability dissolved. When outcomes succeeded, credit consolidated. This imbalance was structural, not personal. And it persisted because it worked, protecting the system from internal rupture and sustained challenge. Near the end, she reflects on the paradox of observation without absorption. Remaining adjacent allowed her to retain clarity, but it also required restraint. She could see the machine clearly because she was not fully inside it. That clarity, however, came with isolation. Distance protected integrity, but limited impact. The section closes with a sober conclusion. Power, she realized, did not need to corrupt everyone. It only needed enough people to comply quietly. Watching the machine from the inside taught her this. The most dangerous systems are not built on malice, but on convenience. And they run smoothly precisely because so few are willing to step out of their path. Number 7. Choosing the final word. The final section explains why this document exists at all. Not to accuse, but to conclude. By writing it, Rob Reiner's wife reclaimed authorship over her own narrative. It is less a revelation than a boundary drawn in ink, a decision to stop explaining and start recording. The shock is not what is said, but that it was finally written. She begins by clarifying what this report is not. It is not a memoir shaped for sympathy. It is not a corrective aimed at public opinion. It does not seek resolution through validation. Instead, it functions as a ledger, an account kept for accuracy rather than reaction. She writes that explanation had become endless, always adjusted for audience, timing, and tolerance. Recording, by contrast, required no permission. Throughout the section, she reflects on how silence and speech had both been misinterpreted over the years. Silence was taken as acceptance. Speech was treated as disruption. Writing offered a third option: permanence without confrontation. I wanted something that did not need to be answered, she wrote, only acknowledged by existing. The document was not an argument, it was a marker. She describes the decision to write as gradual rather than dramatic. No single incident triggered it. Instead, accumulation did. Patterns repeated often enough to demand documentation. The report suggests that memory alone was no longer sufficient protection. Too much had been reframed, softened, or reassigned. Writing became a way to stabilize truth before it shifted again, anchoring experience to language rather than recollection alone, preserving detail without distortion. Midway through the section, she addresses fear. Not fear of consequence, but fear of misinterpretation. Once written, words could travel beyond context. They could be excerpted, simplified, misunderstood. She accepted that risk deliberately. Misreading was no longer worse than erasure, she observed. At least the record would exist. The act of writing also rebalanced power. Until this point, narratives about her life had largely been reactive, responses to other people's versions. This report reversed that dynamic. It did not wait for prompts. It did not anticipate rebuttal. In doing so, it removed urgency from the equation. Time no longer dictated tone. She writes candidly about the relief that followed. Not closure in the cinematic sense, but steadiness. The constant internal editing, what to say, when to say it, how it might land, quieted. Once recorded, the burden of carrying memory alone lifted. I no longer needed to remember everything, she wrote, because the page would. The report frames authorship as an ethical act. To record is to refuse distortion. To write is to choose precision over performance. She makes clear that this was not about winning a narrative battle, but about ending one. The final word was not aimed outward. It was aimed inward, restoring coherence between experience and recollection, and re-establishing personal authority. She also acknowledges what the document cannot do. It cannot force recognition. It cannot correct every omission. It cannot protect against future reinterpretation, but it can exist intact. That, she argues, is enough. A boundary drawn does not need enforcement to matter. Its presence alone changes the terrain, even if no one acknowledges it publicly. As the section nears its end, she reflects on timing. Writing too early would have sounded defensive, too late, and it would have become history shaped by others. This moment, quiet, deliberate, felt precise. The right time, she wrote, was when I no longer needed anything from the response. The section closes with a restrained but resonant conclusion. The report exists because memory is fragile and narratives drift. By choosing the final word, she did not demand agreement. She claimed authorship, and in doing so, she ensured that whatever stories continue to circulate, one version will remain untouched, written not to persuade, but to endure, quietly and without revision. In the end, this report is not about scandal or revelation. It is about authorship, about what happens when a life lived alongside power chooses clarity over noise, record over reaction. Across these 7 details, a pattern emerges, not of bitterness, but of discipline, of silence used carefully, boundaries drawn deliberately, and memory preserved before it could be rewritten by time. What makes this story endure is not fame, but restraint. The quiet decisions, the unseen labor, the choice to step back, observe, and finally, write things down without asking permission. It reminds us that legacy is not only what is celebrated publicly, but what is protected privately, and what is preserved when attention fades. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you value stories told with patience and precision, subscribe for more documentaries like this, where what's left unsaid matters just as much as what remains.